From 2004, it's Ewan McGregor and Charley Boorman's first travel log, their motorcycle journey called Long Way Round. Now, I had watched this when it came out. I also watched Long Way Down. When Long Way Up came out, I assumed you couldn't watch it because Long Way Round and Long Way Down had segments in it that were TVMA. So that wouldn't be appropriate for you. But I started watching Long Way Up and it was different. They didn't have that. It wasn't that level. I think most of them were TV-14. So I would watch them first and then I would censor anything you couldn't see, which wasn't very much. And you really liked Long Way Up.
Yes. And that's why I wanted to see this. I think that this TV series was much different than Long Way Up, but I liked it for that reason. It's always something different, not just the parts of the world that they go in, but how they get there.
I agree. Now this one was much more raw than the other two. You haven't seen Long Way Down yet. We're gonna tackle that at some point. This is far more raw than the other two, but in the sequence in which they were released and how I watched them originally, I loved this when it came out. So now comparing it to the other two, which were more refined, they had gotten their groove down by the time they got to the end of Long Way Down. They knew how to do these journeys and they knew what they were looking for and they knew what to look for. Mm-hmm. And as they got older and more mature and wiser, they approached everything differently. So this is a couple of young guys and it's very raw and they don't really know what they're doing. And that's part of the appeal of it though. I mean, they just have this idea. Ewan has this idea. He approaches Charley. They're buddies because they met on a movie set and they both love motorcycles. And Ewan calls Charley up at one point and says, I have this idea that we should ride around the world. We're gonna go out of my house, turn left and go east. From England, we're gonna go east to New York City, which means they're gonna travel around the world. And they decide, hey, yeah, we're gonna do this and we're gonna bring some cameras along and document it.
Yeah.
And they know nothing about what they're doing. And that's the appeal of this, is how raw and inexperienced they are at doing this.
Yeah, I think that it was very interesting how they dealt with this. I liked how they showed us how hard it was to actually get going on their journey. And I liked that because it was something different, like I said. And seeing them do Long Way Up before, it kind of feels interesting because Long Way Up, they didn't show any of that, so it was like it was easy.
Well, they did. You didn't see that first couple of episodes, but they don't focus on that nearly as much as they did here, because here it was all new. They actually took training courses of how to defend themselves, should they be kidnapped or taken hostage, because they were going to be traveling through places that potentially that could happen. So they took self-defense training. They had to have all these shots. They had to fill out all this paperwork and get passport approval and get approval from the countries to pass through them. There was a lot more of that type of paper chase that they went through in this. They did something similar in Long Way Up, but it was much less. Because of the areas they were traveling and because of the experience and them knowing what they were looking for and what they were going to have to go through, we didn't see that. We'd already seen that, so they didn't show it to us, which is one of the reasons I actually prefer Long Way Up. But it is interesting to see what they had to deal with to get through this.
When they were, those first couple of episodes, when they were doing that, I actually got very scared because they were taking all those self-defense classes and all of that stuff, and I got scared for them because I didn't know what was going to happen. And even when they go to some places, they have to stay in a place, and it seems scary. I would not want to sleep there.
I agree. They were very trusting. I mean, they did have cameras with them, but they would, they were going through Kazakhstan, I think was the place, and they met this person, and the person said, oh, come to my house and stay tonight. And they would do that. Now, we saw them do that in Long Way Up, but it was much different atmosphere. And here, I mean, they were at this one house, and the guy came downstairs with an AK-47, and he was dancing and had a drink in one hand, and you could see Ewan looking at Charley. And Ewan, of course, I think probably felt at risk because he's a big star. He's a movie star. He'd been in Star Wars, and potentially, these people could take him hostage for some reason or try to make a point by hurting him. And so I agree with you. It was a little bit scary. And the first time I watched it, I probably thought that, but even more so now, having known how big Ewan McGregor has become and how these guys are famous, really what kind of a risk they were taking doing that at the time.
Yeah, I think what is also interesting to me is the camera quality. At least in the first episodes when they started on their journey. I think it was interesting to see how low, I guess, or
How
a step
primitive,
back.
how
Yes.
low quality the cameras were.
Yes, and then I compared it to Long Way Up, and Long Way Up had very good footage
Exactly.
and higher quality.
And it shows you how much the quality of the cameras they were using has improved from 2004 to 2020. 16 years. Those GoPros that they had on the helmets for this were terrible. The footage was just, it was grainy and it was not high def at all.
Especially when it was raining.
Exactly. And you're right, it was far better in Long Way Up, and it was, the scenery was much more beautiful. It did the scenery justice in Long Way Up. It did not do that in Long Way Round. Now, of course, they traveled through Kazakhstan, as I mentioned, Mongolia, Siberia, Alaska. They get bogged down in a couple of these places really badly. In fact, they think about abandoning part of the trip and taking an easier way. And then they don't do that, and ultimately they wind up at that orphanage where Ewan meets that little girl. And when we see Long Way Up later, he went back and adopted that little girl. And he talks
Right.
about in Long Way Up how his life would have changed if they'd taken the easy way out instead of the hard way.
Right. I knew that was the girl. I got very curious because it was very interesting how they were just taking a journey and they saw her, they moved on, and then 2 years later went back and got her again.
Yeah, she obviously made an impression on him.
Yes.
Also in this series, there were some accidents that occurred. Ewan twice with the motorcycle when he was pumping gas got gas in his eye, and he had just had an operation on his eye prior to this so that his vision would be 20/20, and he could have lost sight in that eye, and that would have affected him. Obviously, it would affect a normal person who leads a normal life, but somebody who's in the movies, it would have certainly affected. So that happened to him twice. He also got bumped from behind when I think they were in Alaska, which could have been, he could have been killed in that accident. And of course, one of the chase vehicles with one of the directors in it and some of the crew tipped over, and they were involved in an accident as well. So they did have some serious things going on in this.
Yes, I think when it was the first 2 episodes and Ewan was just kind of learning how to drive in certain areas.
He was struggling with the off-road. When
Right.
they were training to drive off-road, he was struggling with that, yes.
And that's why I don't think that it was his fault when it was the accidents, because he was on the road. So the person that was driving behind him can't blame him. And I found that when he got the gas in his eye, he did it twice, which could have hurt twice as bad, and I'm sure it did. And that just kind of blew my mind. And then you look at Long Way Up, and they barely had any accidents.
Which you know, I appreciate it. Again, they're older, they're wiser, they're more experienced. You know, the motorcycles they were riding here, there was an issue with that too. They wanted to ride a different type of motorcycle. That company didn't believe they could make the journey. So they pulled their support, and they wound up on the BMW motorcycles, which were okay, but they were big, heavy bikes. So every time they dumped the bike, it really was a task to get the bike upright. Also, the outfits they were wearing that BMW supplied, I think were very cumbersome. I don't think they enjoyed that very much. Charley, I don't think enjoyed the camping, whereas Ewan liked to camp and wanted to camp more. Here, unlike Long Way Up, I think it was different. They didn't do a lot of touristy kind of stuff. And I like that. I like when they do the normal person kind of thing. But they really were at a lot more like personal residences of people that they didn't know. You know, the cop from a town would say, "Come stay at my house," and they would do that. So we really got a very backyard view of these areas. Whereas in Long Way Up, I think they balanced it out between, meeting people, just walk of life people, and showing us beautiful places. I like that balance better. I think Long Way Down has that balance as well. I think this one was, and maybe there just wasn't as much stuff to see. That one church with all the bones, that was creepy, and I mean, everything here felt a little empty for me, like a little scary, a little lonely. That's not a
Yes.
comment on the series, it's just a comment on the places that they were.
Yes, I think in Long Way Up I felt upbeat. I was excited for them. And there were times where I was scared for them, but I was more excited than scared. This, I was kind of just stressed that they were going to get hurt, even though I knew that they would survive because I had seen Long Way Up after the fact, or before the fact. I think that this is interesting because it's their first time and how much they didn't know for this.
There was one point where they couldn't cross this river. There were all these trucks were backed up, and their little caravan was backed up. They ultimately got their vehicles on some trucks to get across this river, but it was a chore. They couldn't get the trucks into the river, these big trucks that other people were driving that had nothing to do with our group. And so they started, Ewan and Charley and the two directors and the crew started chipping away at the bank of the river and putting soil and dirt and rock into the river so that the truck would have something to ramp itself down to. And I was watching it, and it reminded me of the film Sorcerer with Roy Scheider, how raw it was and how lonely, and how they were just out there on their own trying to get across this river. And if they couldn't do it, where were they going to go?
Right.
So I agree. And I think, again, that was the appeal of this series, is how raw, how lonely, how out on their own they were, and how inexperienced they were at this kind of travel.
Yes, I think Ewan McGregor and Charley Boorman were very good in this. I think that they are the right people to do this. I really liked this for different reasons than I liked Long Way Up, and I like how each of these series, at least I've watched, are different than each other.
I agree. And after watching all three so far, now I have to go back and watch Long Way Down. I read the book and I watched the series, but I'm going to watch it again with you. I'll have to see if I feel the same way after this. Long Way Up so far is my favorite. I think because they're older, they're wiser. I like that part of the world perhaps better than where they were in this one. So for me right now, Long Way Up is at the top, and as I remember it, Long Way Down would be second and this is third, but that doesn't mean this isn't good. I really do enjoy this. I definitely think it's one to see, but I think you should see them in order. I think you should go Long Way Round, Long Way Down, Long Way Up, because really that is, it evolves properly that way. But for me, this is one to see.
For me, this is one to see too. Even though I watched Long Way Up first, I really liked this. I liked seeing how different it was and how they got through their challenges and ended up getting to New York. So, one to see.
All right, well, we'll be back with Long Way Down at some point. I wonder if there'll be a long way over, a long way home, a long, long road, a long and winding road. I'm going too long. Okay, never mind. See what I did there?
Oh, Daddy.